On November 13th, the Supreme Court strongly opposed the practice of bulldozer justice, ruling that state governments cannot demolish the homes of people accused or convicted of crimes just because of their criminal background. The court made it clear that the government cannot act as a judge and warned that demolitions without following proper legal procedures would face serious consequences. The court also laid down rules to regulate such demolitions. It said a 15-day notice must be given to the affected residents, allowing them to either challenge the order or prepare for eviction. The notice should clearly explain the reasons for the demolition and give a date for a hearing. The court also said all demolitions must be recorded on video to ensure fairness. This ruling has been welcomed by many, as bulldozer justice was often seen as a quick but unfair way of dealing with alleged offenders. But what does this decision really mean? And will it be followed in practice? We are talking to Clifton D. Rosario, a practicing advocate with Manhattan Law and the General Secretary of the All India Lawyers Association for Justice, to know more about this judgment. Thank you so much for joining firstly. So what do you think of these guidelines that have been given by the Supreme Court regarding bulldozer justice? What's your opinion about it firstly?
I think just to understand the implications, right, of what this bulldozer justice came to mean would be important if we were to evaluate the kind of impact that these judgments had. We all know that over the past few years, this bulldozer justice was being portrayed as a sign of a justice meeting, or an instant justice meeting out kind of a system that the BJP had come up with. Of course, it began in the context of Madhya Pradesh, where Yogi Adityanath is the chief minister, and the bulldozer became Uttar Pradesh, sorry, and the bulldozer became this sign of domination, particularly over the Muslim community. Because if you realize that this so-called bulldozer justice, I mean, really, that formulation itself is wrong, because it is bulldozer injustice at its very minimum. But the formulation as bulldozer justice, as they came up with, it had a particular method to it. And the method was very clear, that there would be some kind of altercation, more often than not, something that was motivated, that was created, a kind of a tension, some kind of a communal tension that was created, where, of course, there would be the intervention of the state. There would also be certain kinds of, responses from communities. Some kind of altercation would take place that would result in certain crimes, criminal offenses being recorded by the police. And those people who were accused in those crimes, you had their properties, their homes, and even their commercial establishments, small shops, juggies, that kind of thing, that were being demolished. And this became a pattern. This is not something that was isolated. So it began in Uttar Pradesh under Yogi Adityanath, but then it very quickly transferred to almost all the other BJP states, whether it is Madhya Pradesh, whether it is Assam, whether it is even Maharashtra. This is something that you saw. Of course, I must place a caveat here. The use of bulldozers to demolish the houses of the poor is something that is, part of Indian history in that sense, post-independence. The poor have always had to face, whether it is slum dwellers, jogdis, they've always had to face this, and there's been a continuous fight against that dehumanization, this kind of a dehumanization by the state. And that's something that still continues. Parallelly, this is something that still continues. But bulldozer justice, as they called it, had a peculiar political messaging, which was what was extremely problematic. And if you remember, even in the US, where certain diaspora were tilted completely right wing, the kind of programs that they had some kind of celebrations and you'd have the bulldozer being portrayed as the symbol of strength of the BJP. Now it is in that context, I think, that we need to understand that these judgments, and let me also tell you that it's not just one judgment, there are two judgments. One that was passed on 6th of November by a three-judge bench led by Justice Chandrachud, and another judgment which was passed on 13th November, exactly 1 week later, which was by a bench led by Justice Gawai. So there are these two judgments now that have spoken very, very clearly about the unacceptability of bulldozer justice. So when we talk about these judgments, what you have is in effect two judgments of the Supreme Court calling out this communal kind of inhuman policy of the BJP as being lawlessness, as being unconstitutional, as being unacceptable. That, I think, is the fundamental relevance.
Also, please correct me here, but as per the understanding, as per law, if a property, if that's an illegal property or something and that has to be demolished, there is a process that can be used by the state government. There are laws regarding that. So ideally, anyway, any illegal structure has to be demolished in a particular manner, and a legal structure cannot be, of course, demolished without any notices. So are these separate guidelines? Like, is it even necessary if we ask for it? Because there has to be a law that's already in place. Shouldn't that only be followed? Because even now, as per the guidelines, the exceptions are there, that if it's illegal or if it's on the footpath or something regarding that, then it has to be demolished in a way. But why do we need a very separate guidelines? Like, is it necessary?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in a way, and then I think there's something that we have in law where we say that there is something called the rule of law, which basically is that the Constitution, the entire legal framework, the entire legal infrastructure, authorities, etc., abide by the Constitution, abide by these laws strictly, and that is the rule of law. But you also have something which has now become far more predominant, which is the rule by law. Now, the rule by law does not have constitutional morality. It doesn't have adherence to legal principles, to doctrines. It doesn't have anything. It is where where there is might, there is political might. That is, you come to power, that you will use the law in the way you deem fit. Now, that's in regard to this so-called encroachments. This is something that you have. I mean, just for your information, if you were to look at any city, there would hardly be a small percentage of structures which are completely illegal.
Yeah.
So if you were to look at, building bylaws, if you were to look at, the kind of plan sanctions and whether they've actually abided by it, you look at all of this. So there are a lot of illegalities that are going all over the place. But more often than not, the gaze of the law is on the structures of the poor, of the working class, which is why, you'll hear of a demolition drive of a juggi jobri, of a slum. Yeah. You're not going to hear a kind of a demolition drive, say, in an area where there is building violations. So, the law itself, in that sense, has been applied as per the whims and fancies of the executive, as it were. But today we are in a far more difficult kind of a situation, because you have a political dispensation, which is the BJP in power, which really has no respect for the Constitution or the rule of law. It is the rule by law, it is the rule of force, and it is the rule of communal thinking, is something that they have been, that they've really institutionalized. So it's very easy for someone to say, hey, but you're illegal, so you need to go. Perhaps you'll also, use a notice, you'll issue a notice as well. But that's not what's happening. If you look at these entire demolitions, what came to be called as bulldozer justice, it was the specific disproportionate targeting of the Muslims that really was something that was very worrisome. And also then the kind of, the houses of also Dalits, Adivasis, and other poorer communities. So when you were faced with state lawlessness, where the state was not abiding by the rule of law, these judgments, have come at have basically called out the state lawlessness and reminded the executive, reminded these governments that they'll have to, willy-nilly follow the rule of law, and this rule by law is something that is not going to be tolerated.
So it's like again the Supreme Court in a way is telling the political authorities specifically to abide by the constitution, and it's just a reminder again in those ways. Is it that?
It's more than that, right? I mean, it's if you look at these judgments, so basically we'll just get into the judgments. Okay. There are two judgments. The first judgment is in re Manoj Tibrewal Akash, which was passed by a 3-judge bench. That is Justice Chandrachud, Justice Pardiwala, and Justice Manoj Mishra. This was a judgment that was passed on 6th of November. Now, this is a very interesting case. This was an interesting case because the person, this Mr. Manoj Tibrewal, he's a journalist, a very senior journalist. It's quite likely that, he's written against the government or whatever it is. But basically, his property, his ancestral home, came to be demolished on the ground that it was an encroachment onto the national highway. And he went to court. And we know the judgment. The court has directed that, he has to be paid compensation of 25 lakhs, so on and so forth. But importantly, what the court has said, that even where you're talking about an encroachment, the state has to follow the rule of law. I'll just read out 2-3 portions from that judgment. So what the court says in this is, justice through bulldozers is unknown to any civilized system of jurisprudence. There is a grave danger that if high-handed and unlawful behavior is permitted by any wing or officer of the state, demolition of citizens' properties will take place as a selective reprisal for extraneous circumstances. The court then goes on to say, the state must follow due process of law before taking action to remove illegal encroachments or unlawfully constructed structures. Bulldozer justice is simply unacceptable under the rule of law. So having said this, the court then goes on to lay down certain guidelines where even if a structure is supposedly illegal, you'll have to do this. You'll have to issue a notice. You have to demonstrate that there's an illegality. There has to be a due process before any action is taken. So that was the first judgment. Now this judgment deals with where you're saying that there's an illegality, there's an encroachment, the structure itself is illegal. The second judgment comes 1 week later. This is on 13th of November. And this is called in directions in the matter of demolitions of structures. This is by a 2-judge bench of the Supreme Court, Justice Gavai and Justice Vishwanathan. Now, this judgment is it's in a very particular context. So the court actually frames the question that came before it in this fashion. It says, whether the properties of the persons who are accused of committed certain crimes, or for that matter, even convicted for commission of criminal offences, can be demolished without following the due process of law or not. Basically, the question it posed was, is bulldozer justice permissible or not? And the court, in no uncertain terms, says that that's not permissible, and that's the kind of guideline that it is. So these are the 2 judgments now that we are talking about.
And do you think will these guidelines be followed? Because we know that politicians have a tendency to find loopholes and anyway do what they want to do. They're notorious that way. Do you expect that it would be followed?
I think the Constitution also, people have posed this question several of times that Article 21 talks about right to life. That every person, every citizen, has this right to life in this country. You've had the Supreme Court interpret that judgment to mean that it's not just a life of animal existence. It's a life with dignity. You have access to basic amenities. You're not interfered with, so on and so forth. But of course, you can say that where is that exist today? But the fact is that because you have these laws, because you have this constitution, that you can talk about the rule of law. You can talk about a claim to citizenship. You can actually make a claim to rights that have to be accrued to you. You can fight for it on the streets, and that these laws, this constitution give you that right as well. And you can also take it to the courts. So it is very important, that judgments like this are passed as a reminder to the state that at the end of the day, they have to follow what the constitution says, and they have to follow what the laws lay down. Now, so for instance, in this judgment, in the second judgment, what the court actually says is this. It doesn't just lay down these guidelines. After laying down all of these guidelines, and I'll get into that, maybe later in this talk as to what those guidelines are. It also goes on to say that if there is any violation of these guidelines, it makes it very, very clear. It says that if there is any violation of these guidelines, contempt proceedings would be initiated against the responsible officials, in addition to their prosecution, and the officials will be held personally responsible for restitution of the demolished property at their personal cost, in addition to paying damages. So now what the court has interestingly done is to say, okay, see, the law was always there. You couldn't have done this. And now that, you all have engaged in this, yes, we are putting you on notice that you can't do this anymore. And we are saying that over and above that, we are laying down all of these guidelines that you have to follow. These are mandatory. These are not directly, these are not something that you can choose to follow or not follow. You have to follow them. And if you don't follow them, then you cannot claim, that you are under some pressure politically, which is why you did it. Because you will be held personally responsible for that. And I think that that may actually play an important role in ensuring that officials comply with the rule of law.
So here basically, like you mentioned, that because now the officer would have to have the personal burden, they might have to give the money to the victims. That may make the officials say no and not get into this sort of justice system more than anything, apart from having on the political side. Even the individual level, this is creating a barrier for people right now.
Yeah, but I think, just a word of caution here as well. It is not like, that if you look at the bureaucracy and the manner in which they've been functioning, particularly in states that are ruled by the BJP, elsewhere as well, you realize that there is a very communal mindset that has crept in. And you have officials who need to be bound by the constitution, who need to be bound by the rule of law, actually flaunting it because of their own political beliefs as well. So something like this may actually play an important role in, in addressing that to an extent. But like I said, whether it's the constitution, whether it is any law, or whether it is even these guidelines, at the end of the day, the implementation on this would really depend on how vigilant we as a society are, how vigilant, civil society organizations, opposition parties, trade unions, other, collectives of people, how vigilant they are in ensuring that this is implemented.
So it's the onus is on the people right now, how well they take responsibility of this as well.
The onus is not on them in that sense. But I think if you want these things to be done, unfortunately, the situation in this in our country is that you'll have to fight for it.
Voice it. Also, are there any loopholes that can be misused in this judgment?
I mean, before getting to that, actually, just a couple of things that I wanted to say about these guidelines, because it's a 93-page judgment, the second judgment. Yeah. The first judgment is only 15 pages, so I think people will read it.
Yeah.
The second judgment is a 93-page judgment. And it
95-page, I think.
95-page judgment. And the point is that in arriving at its conclusion, that this form of really state violence is unacceptable, is unconstitutional. There is a reasoning that it goes through. I just want to point out some of the important kind of reasoning. One of the things that's really notable in this judgment is that it actually begins with this poem by the poet, the very famous poet. I think it's Pradeep, right? It was his poem where they say, "Apna ghar ho, apna aangan ho, is ख्वाब में हर कोई जीता है." So the judgment actually begins with that, and I think it's very important as a reiteration of how important a home is to a person. It could be a hut, it could be, this ancestral home that we talk about in the previous case. This, you cannot just, interfere with this in this kind of a lawless fashion. In fact, the judgment also goes on to say and remind the executive the importance of homes to people. So what the court says is, for an average citizen, the construction of a house is often the culmination of years of hard work, dreams, and aspirations. A house is not just a property, but embodies the collective hopes of a family or individuals for stability, security, and a future. Having a house or a roof over one's head gives satisfaction to any person. It gives a sense of dignity and a sense of belonging. So the court actually, upholds this right to shelter in no uncertain terms. The second ground that the court has struck down this bulldozer justice is it says in not that many words, but in effect, that bulldozer justice is state lawlessness. In fact, the court says is this: the executive cannot become a judge and decide that a person accused is guilty and therefore punish him by demolishing his residential commercial properties. Such an act of the executive would be transgressing its limits. And it then goes on to say, the chilling sight of a bulldozer demolishing a building when authorities have failed to follow the basic principles of natural justice and have acted without adhering to the principles of due process reminds one of a lawless state of affairs where might was right. Now, this is a very strong, indication of what the authorities have been doing in BJP ruled states. The third ground that the court uses, it actually invokes the doctrine of public trust and public accountability to say that this is how we are going to restrain this kind of unbridled state lawlessness. And which is why the court then goes on to say that the officials will have to know that they are going to be held personally liable if they engage in such kind of lawlessness. The fourth thing is also very interesting, where the court actually does not, it says there was an argument that was made before the court that, these people are all, they may be accused in a crime, but it's by coincidence that their properties
were in breach. Yeah.
What can we do? We have to take action against them. So here the court actually says that, the submission is made that these accused people have violated the municipal laws. So the court goes on to say, however, when a particular structure is chosen all of a sudden for demolition and the rest of the similarly situated structures in the same vicinity are not even being touched, malafide may loom large. And then it goes on to say, a presumption could then be drawn that the real motive for the demolition was not the illegal structure, but an act of penalizing the accused without even trying him before the court of law. So this is again another ground that the court uses to reject it. And finally, and I think most importantly, the court actually invokes the unacceptability of collective punishment. The court says, in any house, it's not just one person living. Somebody may be accused and it may be a property that is, an encroachment, but that person is living there with their family. So when you're punishing, you're doing collective punishment, and that is not accepted. So the court then goes on to say, in our view, if demolition of a house is permitted, wherein number of persons of a family or a few families reside, only on the ground that one person residing in such a house is either an accused or convicted in the crime, it will amount to inflicting a collective punishment on the entire family or families residing in such structure. In our considered view, our constitutional scheme and the criminal jurisprudence could never permit the same. So these are all the grounds. These are all the grounds that the court invokes to nullify bulldozer justice. And I think we should not be too caught up only with the guidelines. It's very important, the guidelines. But I think the reasoning for declaring bulldozer justice as unconstitutional, unacceptable in a civilized society is equally important.
Also, the people who have been victims of bulldozer justice in the past, will they be able to make use of this judgment? Are there anything that the court has said that compensation for them? Because now that the judgment has come, it would mean for the future cases. But anything for the victims?
Yeah, actually, I think this is also in continuation of your previous question in terms of, what is it the court did and what is it that it could have done. Yeah. I'll just finish off what the court did, what are the mandatory guidelines, and then I'll come to what it could have done and, what it means for those whose houses, the thousands and thousands of people whose houses have been demolished and many cases are pending in the Supreme Court as well as the High Court. So basically, now the guidelines that the Supreme Court has laid are, you can look at it at 6 points. The first point that the Supreme Court says is that there cannot be any demolition unless there is a prior show cause notice issued 15 days before any proposed demolition. And this notice should contain the details of the supposed, what do you call this?
The
Encroachment.
For the
yes, and interestingly, the court also says that every municipality must now have a designated portal, a digital portal, which will carry such notices in them. So you now the court authorities previously they'd say, "Humne to notice de di." Now kotti di. Actually, they wouldn't have given a notice. So one makes notice mandatory. Second, it also puts in place a mechanism where you cannot have backdated notices. The second thing, the second guideline that the court hears is that after this is done, the notice is issued and the reply is given to it, there will be a personal hearing, and not only of the to the person that will be given to them, and this minutes of this hearing will also be prepared. Thirdly, then the court says that after this, the concerned authority can pass its final order, but that final order cannot just say that, okay, we said this, they said that, I'm sorry, your house is going to be demolished. It has to give reasons why it is going to reject whatever explanation has been given by the person. And secondly, while passing this order, the authority must also inform the person whether this particular encroachment, this particular unauthorized construction can be compounded, which means that it does not need to be demolished. So the court has made it mandatory now for the authorities to make this part of their order. So this is the third part in regard to the order. Fourthly, the court says that even after this order is passed, 15 days time is given to the person to approach the concerned appellate authorities, which may be the court or whatever, challenging this order. So now this overnight demolition, suddenly, in the morning, the demolition bulldozer is coming. That the court has tried to put an end to. Fifthly, what the court says, and this is interesting, the court says that all demolitions have to be mandatorily videographed. And a demolition report has to be created in which the list of police officials and other bureaucrats who took part in that have to be listed out. And this report as well and the video should also be displayed in the online portal. And then sixthly, like I said before, the court has said if there is any violation of these directions, even one direction, then contempt proceedings will be initiated against all those officials who are listed in the demolition report. Now, these are the things that the court says. The court then clarifies, and this is something that was, in my opinion, it ought not to have been done. The court says that these directions will not apply to unauthorized structures on public places such as road, street, footpath, railway line, river body, water bodies, etc. Now, in my opinion, this was absolutely unnecessary because this is what they're going to say that, but here I think there are two important, I think, safeguards that we have. One is in this judgment itself, where the court said that if you are singled out for action and there are other people around you who have committed similar encroachments, no one else has got the notice, then you can raise the ground that this is a malified action of the state, which then, will be set aside. Secondly, and more importantly, is the first judgment of the Supreme Court on 6th November by 3 judges, which is specifically in regard to encroachments. In my understanding, even encroachments are covered by the first judgment. So in that sense, though this judgment may have opened this loophole, it does not, still the state does not escape because of the first judgment. Now coming to what the judgment could have done, or rather what the judgment has not done. And here I think, though in a way this rings the death knell, for this form of targeted demolition of houses, and especially this weaponization of the bulldozer as a weapon, of Hindutva politics. It actually puts a break on that. It does not specifically recognize that it's Muslims who have been disproportionately affected by this. And I would say that this is one thing that the court, missed. The second thing that the court probably missed is that bulldozer justice, it sought to create this kind of a euphoria over the suffering of other people who are predominantly Muslims or poor Adivasi Dalits. It tried to make that the celebration of their sufferings, which actually attacks the fundamental principle of fraternity, which is there in our constitution. That is a finding I think that is lacking. Thirdly, I think the court also should have said that these guidelines that it has laid down, it should apply to all the pending cases.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that is not done. But still, I think insofar as the pending cases are concerned, given that Justice Chandrachud's judgment has already held that any demolition, even of an encroachment without due procedure, is illegal and compensation should be paid. And then all of these guidelines are now laid down. Each of the demolitions that have taken place till now will have to be tested against these norms to see whether they've been followed or not. It's interesting. Let us see how the courts interpret that.
So it's still on the court now whether they will take up these guidelines for the pending cases and how they interpret it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what happens in that. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, there were hundreds of houses that were demolished in Khargone, in the backdrop of a very kind of a created violence around the Ram Navami Yatra. Those cases are pending in the Madhya Pradesh High Court. Many such cases are pending even in the High Courts in Uttar Pradesh. Many cases are pending in the Supreme Court as well. Let us see what the court has in them. But having said that, there is no taking away from the fact that these two judgments are definitely welcome and a slap in the face for the BJP, even though it was not a slap.
Also, lastly, while I think there are a lot of editorials, a lot of people have welcomed this judgment, they've spoken about it, appreciating it. But what does it tell us about the overall system, justice system? Like, because this seems to be like an achievement, but like you mentioned, as per the rule of law, this shouldn't have even happened in the first place. Like, the idea of bulldozer justice shouldn't have even taken place as per our rule of law. And now it's like a small achievement, this judgment that has come out. So what does it say about our justice system right now?
I think something that much has been written about, and most people acknowledge that even the judiciary is at crossroads in terms of the path that it has to take. There have been enough number of people who have written about the manner in which the RSS has tried to ensure that judges who subscribe to their ideology find a place within the judiciary itself. And there are enough number of examples that we have of it. So in that sense, I think this is actually for the judiciary now to stand up and be counted. And in that sense, this I think is a very, very important judgment, because this bulldozer justice was literally the crowning glory of people like Yogi Adityanath, and spoken with great valorization even by Prime Minister Modi. So for the court to have actually clamped down on it for the illegality that it is extremely important. It's an assertion of the rule of law. It's also an assertion of the independence of the judiciary, that the judiciary has to be objective, has to protect constitutional values, has to be guided by constitutional morality in every single judgment. And I would say that this judgment is an example of that. And in a way, it reveals, it's important that the courts continue to pass such kind of judgments, especially when you're seeing such a fascist attack in the country right now.
Thank you so much, sir.
No problem. Thank you.